Hey, fellow Geonteers, those of us like our spirituality with a twist. So, today we're talking about one of our absolute fave psychologists, Carl Jung. We're doing a little G&T series on Jung, but we're kind of doing the thing of trying to catch what you might say two birds with one stone, because we'll also be talking about Bernardo Kastrup, who's a really interesting figure now, one of the most popular philosophers on kind of philosophy and I guess you'd say metaphysics of consciousness. Kastrup himself is fascinated by Jung, so we'll be looking a little bit at both of them, kind of focused on Jung, but looking at the Kastrup of Jung too. And for this particular episode today, we're going to be talking about the Jungian concept of the daimon. What? It's Daimon, a daimon, not a demon, but a daimon. And this is Jung's notion of people having something like a guiding spirit. So we'll be kind of like hashing it out today. And I guess we all get to think about things like, do we feel like we have a guiding spirit? Do we feel like everybody has a guiding spirit? Do we feel like we always want to follow our guiding spirits? Those will be the questions of the episode, I suppose. But before we get into all the fun, deep stuff, if you could do all the things everybody asks, which would be liking and subscribing and writing a review and sharing with a friend, that would be great because our goal is to share as much guiding spirit kind of stuff to everybody as much as we can. And it's greatly appreciated if you'll do that. Thanks so much. All right. So this is the episode on the daimon. I have to say it's a little bit funny because that Bernardo Castro guy, Daniel, wrote a book about the daimon now too. He's obviously really into it.
Mm.
And I was looking at it on Audible and they put it under demonology because they couldn't tell the difference
Probably
between
done
the
by
diamond
AI
and the
anyways.
demon. So you click on it, and then the bottom of the yeah, there probably is AI. On the bottom of the thing, you start getting shit about like the Satanic Bible and like weird rituals and shit. So, anyways, the flaws of AI. All right, so I guess I'll drop a little bit of what this is about, and you can like tell me which parts you're interested in as we go. Right?
Hmm.
Sound good? Okay, so we were kind of talking about the person having like multiple parts, and this is kind of a typical thing to do when you're trying to like, I guess it's in Buddhism or Taoism and these things, you start breaking the person up into parts. And I think Kastrup does this in an interesting way with Jung. He says, well, let's look at what we covered last episode. If you want to peek that, if you're listening to this one, you can go to the previous one, where we kind of talked about how the body influences the mind and this like the psychological parts that come from the body into the mind. So we spent a lot of time talking about that. We got pretty deep and pretty philosophical on that last time. And then the other part of this, which again I think is a really interesting way that Kastrup is presenting Jung, is to talk about that is kind of like the lowest part, the body part influencing the mind. And then the other part is to think about this thing that he's calling spirit. And he does this in kind of an interesting way. We'll get to all the Jungian ideas by the end, but he doesn't lead with this thing called the collective unconscious and the archetypes. We'll get to it. But he leads with this idea of the daimon, this idea that everybody has inside of them something that functions, again, something like a spirit guide. In Jung's life, and we talked about this a little bit, but I don't think we went deep into this when we've talked about Jung in our previous episodes over the years. Um, for Jung, he had this kind of vision that started, for him at some point. He first encountered this spirit guide in the dream. It was in autumn of 1913 during this sort of very critical period of his life. And then he started doing kind of an active imagination technique, which has popped up in episodes a little bit here and there for us. This
Hmm.
idea that you kind of do this inner journey and you kind of let your imagination kind of flow and you kind of see what the mind produces. So it's sort of allowing the mind to kind of like free flow and then eventually seeing what you encounter. And he'd already had this dream of this spirit guide experience. And then I think it took him a little bit. It was like the autumn of the 1 year previous. And then by January of 1914, he was doing this kind of inner journeying thing and he kind of really hit this figure.
Hmm.
So that's kind of the Jungian backstory of that. That's really around your World War II time, too. So I think he was Jung, kind of very famously was feeling the tension in him around like the foreshadowings of violence. And so I think it was like a personal time period for him that was pretty intense, I think, in his personal life. And then also the time when it was just intense in the world overall. So,
Yeah, and we've talked about this before with like last episode and previous, with Viktor Frankl and his sort of transcendent moments while he was in, Nazi Germany, in concentration camp, having these, transcendent experiences in the, some of the most hellish, I would say conditions that, humans have ever faced in modern times that we can document. Obviously, we don't know everything, but definitely we could say
Yeah.
concentration camps are in there for sure.
Mhm.
And so I think it highlights the capabilities to which we have under intense pressure, under really severely grim situations, what can arise from those moments, depending on how the person is, I don't want to say wired, maybe we could say inspired, as a foreshadowing for the diamond.
Yeah, and I don't want to make any false comparisons. We're recording this in May 2026. It's probably like the darkest time I felt as an American, not making any false comparisons. Obviously, it's nothing like Franco, but
For
it's
sure.
kind of a bleak time. But it's sometimes what we've been trying to do with this little part of these episodes for us, getting a little meta, is to like, okay, it's a bleaker time, but let's do some stuff that's inspiring.
Yeah.
The diamond, not the demon. Lots of
Diamond
demons going
girl.
on. Yeah, we could use a little diamond as opposed to the demons.
Diamonds are forever.
Girl's best friend. So, okay. Um, so I was doing a little research on this, and this is really interesting. The backstory of this with Jung's love of like classical culture is really interesting because this idea of the diamond goes back, to the people like the Greeks and the Romans. And you find it in people like Socrates, of course, the famous philosopher, where he talks about having this diamond that's kind of this guiding spiritual force that kind of appears to him and kind of like guides him through his life and guides him through his ideas. And Jung, of course, really loves classical Greek culture too. But I thought it's interesting. He goes all the way back to that. So Jung is tapping into these very kind of deep classic ideas. The other part that I didn't know about this, though, was that for the Romans, when this diamond idea enters into Rome, this becomes what they call the genius.
Yeah.
So the root of this word genius really comes from this idea of a guiding spirit that, like I think you were talking about, inspiration that could inspire creativity or insights or whatever that person needs to be inspired with, I suppose, right?
Yeah.
And I didn't, I mean, maybe you knew that. I had never heard that before. I hadn't made the connection between those two words. But it's interesting because I guess in the classical world, if you felt creative and inspired or you had insight or whatever, you would say that something was inspiring you to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And it like kind of took until European culture later, kind of more like Renaissance culture, where that genius word began to be more used for like someone having a particular personal talent.
Mm-hmm.
And you removed it from the spiritual inspiration, which is maybe unfortunate, that it happened, right? So Jung has this love of these, and we'll see it as we go through and we kind of like explore the idea. Jung has this love of these kind of Greek and Roman things, I think especially the Greek world.
Yeah.
And then you get it in other people that Jung loved too, people like the philosopher Nietzsche, where he kind of talks about this idea too of like a lot of times he kind of talks about I didn't know what I was doing and I was kind of going along, but in a way, when I kind of reflected back, it was if there was sort of a guiding hand taking me through or something, right?
So Eric, they have I saw, and as you sent me the notes earlier, so I have some
Yeah, yeah,
prep here.
yeah.
So okay, this is a so genius, right? Because I found this to be really quite interesting.
Me
So
too.
the,
Yeah,
the
but
the
anyways, yeah,
term genius, just as a definition, because we like to give definitions for things. Go Maroons.
yeah.
Um,
That's University of Chicago. Where like, what's the joke? They define the word the. They define the word
yes.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So it's an exceptional natural capacity of intellect, creativity, or skill, and then it says a person who possesses transcendent mental abilities, often described as a high IQ, something like this, right? And so the kind of the definitions are sort of three pieces: ability, personal, and aptitude. One's ability is exceptional, rare, natural intellect or creative power, and it says natural intellect, right? So
Yeah.
someone who is described as a genius has this aspect of them that is a natural. But then the person who possesses this, they say they're endowed with transcendent mental superiority, meaning from me, they're born with this thing, and it's not just a higher level, it's a transcendent level of intellect. And
Yeah.
so that description um, has does have a trend. I mean, they use the word transcendent, but it does have a higher than mundane level of aptitude, right? So you could say someone is highly apt, so they're very good, but then you say someone's a genius, and it's almost irrational, or maybe a
Like
better word of saying,
magical or something, right?
yeah, maybe
Yeah.
better to say unrational rather than irrational. And
Mhm.
it's almost like you can't challenge the genius, right? So a lot of people, and if this offends you, too bad, will say, "Oh, Elon's a genius."
Mhm.
Therefore, don't bother using rationality to critique the intellect or decisions and actions of someone who is a genius because non-genius people cannot understand. And so that goes along and against with what we're saying because on one hand, people will say, okay, well, this person has genius to them, therefore it's transcendent above everybody else, super mundane, right? It's extraordinary, and therefore don't touch them because that's nothing that you could understand. So there's almost like a spiritual aspect to that term. So I just found this to be supremely interesting for the context of this conversation.
Yeah, it's almost like a term that's like then torn kind of, isn't it? Because
Yes.
the older view would be like, no, this is someone who's inspired by something more profound,
Yeah.
and it takes away the ego aspect of it in the arrogant sense, right?
Yes, in the
Yeah.
pejorative.
In the pejorative sense, it takes away that, not in the Buddhist sense or the Jung sense or whatever, right? Like being arrogant. And a lot of the problems we have now is like arrogant actors in the world. There's no doubt that that's the case, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you're
Mm-hmm.
right. There's a kind of a weird, I don't know, coercive move that goes, oh, you can't challenge Peter Thiel. He's like a special genius, or whoever you want to trot out
Yeah.
is the exemplar of that kind of like, I guess, honest to say, toxicity, right? Because there's an arrogance around it,
Mm-hmm.
around the whole concept. Yes, I think that's a good call in that it's a very, it's a, it, I liked hearing that it was an older word with like a different meaning that I wasn't familiar with, and I went,
Yes.
oh, that's interesting. And it's almost like something then goes awry with the word, and then it ends
Mm-hmm.
up being arrogance, and it also is used as kind of like a cudgel to shut people up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can't challenge so and so because Elon's the genius or whoever you want to put into that role. Yeah, this
And
is
it,
like yeah. Go ahead.
even it says the etymology of this word, it started in the 14th century Latin, and it's a guardian spirit or deity which watches over each person from birth. And then over centuries, it evolved to refer to a person's inborn nature and creative talent.
Yeah, that's the
So
thing. Yeah, the word
but
doesn't
that's
twist
not
your
what they're
will.
talking about. Even to a larger point, Eric, people use words that I think have or they assume have a relative universal definition. And so they make the assumption that other people understand the word in the same way that they do. But I think more and more we should be challenging the framing in which things were used. So I was interviewed for a mag in a men's mag or in a magazine that's doing a men's article coming out here in June.
Oh,
And
cool.
many of the questions that the reporter was asking me, I would ask her framing of the question. Why are you framing the question this way? What are you writing the article about? And then what I would do is before I answered, I would change the framing of the question because I didn't like how it was trying to guide me in certain ways. So I think instead of, word to the wise, instead of just accepting things and arguing within the box that is preset for you, take a stab at the box first to make sure that the playing ground is even. So when someone uses a term that we just all accept is the, standard concept for that term itself, maybe it isn't so standard and maybe we should look at where it comes from, such as the word
Yeah.
genius.
Like Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, hasn't come up in our episodes in like a long time. He came up like years ago, like one time.
Mm,
But you can get a little suspicious about how these words are used. And then you could say, I know this is happening in the article that you were being interviewed for, but obviously words can be used neutrally or words can be used to like have an edge,
mm-hmm,
to twist something, or if you want
mm-hmm,
to get darker, manipulate, right?
mm-hmm.
Or oppress. So I think it's a good call. Obviously, I think Jung would agree with that too. Yeah. So it was, I know I found something great about like just seeing that this word that has this very narrow thing now, relatively speaking,
Hmm.
had this source that was, for the point of what we're talking about with Jung and a lot of the spiritual stuff we like to talk about, I think much more profound. So,
Yeah.
mm. Awesome. As far as like super geniusness, we're recording this on the day when the last episode of The Boys is going to be on.
I
Did you watch any of that ever, Daniel? Or
have, yeah, of course.
oh, of course you have. Okay, we never did any Boys episodes. Maybe we just should, just for the fucks of it. But I didn't want to do it. But there's like Sister Sage, right? And
Yeah.
she's this super genius, and I'm kind of interested in how they're going to play that character out. But the odd thing about all the superpowers on that show is they're not natural at all.
No.
If you haven't seen the show, they're all artificially induced by these chemical,
Hmm.
combinations, right? All right. Anyways, a little boy's side, and I don't know if I'll watch it tonight. I'll catch up with it eventually. But mm. All right. So for Jung, he does have this experience of having this personal diamond, and for him, it's this character named Philemon, and he appears as kind of like a what you might call a wisdom figure, kind of like an older, talk about Sister Sage, kind of like a sage, like kind of like the wise old sage looking figure, like a Merlin or a Gandalf or something like that, right? If you want to get to those
Hmm.
things, a Dumbledore or something. He also has these kind of wild wings that they describe as kingfisher wings. So these kind of like, wings that are popping out that he saw. If you want to search it later on online, you can just kind of put Philemon Jung in and you can get some images for it. Um, and it was curious because Jung saw him as this kind of source of wisdom for all these things he wanted to understand. So on the one hand, Jung kind of very famously is interested in Gnosticism. We've done some episodes around that too. We did an interview with Miguel Conner about Gnosticism way back in the day from AM Bite Gnostic Radio. So, anyways, we've talked about this, but Philemon becomes sort of this Gnostic figure for him, kind of opening his eyes to that and kind of the teachings of Alexandria, the Gnostic teachings from the past. He also kind of like enlightens Jung about things like alchemy, which Jung got really fascinated by. And there's a little subpart where he kind of taught Jung a little bit about what the relationship is in like love and sexuality too. That in some ways Philemon was teaching him about um, the connection of the feminine masculine principles as well.
Mm.
And Jung saw him as sort of the embodiment. There's kind of a weird character in like Christian history named Simon Magus. We haven't talked about this guy too much, but he's this figure who's supposed to be one of the first Gnostics. He actually has clashes with Peter in the New Testament. But the people who are more on the Gnostic side saw Simon Magus as like the true voice of Christianity. And he has a feminine partner whose name is Helen. And so I think as Philemon was teaching him, Jung saw that he was also learning stuff about what you might call the alchemical marriage, the meeting of the masculine and feminine principles too, and how that could be a part of your life in love and sexuality and romance, but also like psychologically how those two polarities meet within a person. So, it becomes this kind of massive spirit guide. And that's the basic idea of the daemon. I'll throw it to you, Daniel, for a second to see if
Yeah,
that.
so I wanted to just mention that so Carl Jung, is famous psychologist known for archetypes, the collective unconscious, dream interpretation, right? Student of Sigmund Freud, but definitely a branch, okay, not like a repetition for sure. Known for his sort of shamanic leanings and things like this, a little bit more of the metaphysics of the side of psychology. And, we've told this story before, but for those who are just hearing it now for the first time, he wrote a book called The Red Book about his spirit guide, if you will, Philemon, before he passed, obviously. And he had it in his will not to release the book, I think, until 50 years after he passed.
Yeah, I don't know the exact dates on that, but he kept it on the QT. Very few people saw it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was just released maybe a decade ago.
Yep. I got one sitting in the other room over here in my
Yeah.
little meditation room. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
big thing,
So
actually. Yeah.
it's a big book called The Red Book or Philemon or something
Or
like this.
Liber Novus or something. It goes under different names. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just interesting that such a prodigious, philosopher, psychologist, what do you want to call it, voice of modern thinking, had a metaphysical work of great depth that he had been working on for a very long time. And then, as an intentional and conscious part of his life and understanding of his work beyond his life, had this important work for him intentionally delayed until many years after he passed, with the assumption that he didn't want it tainting the rest of his work and wanted his, the people who were still associated with him to put it out, but to put it out almost at the end of their life. So if he took any flack from, how people might perceive his words from this book, that it wouldn't harm his legacy, which I just think is such a foresight, such a deep level of perspective.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing that he saw at some point, maybe after I'm gone, people might be ready more for this work. I think he maybe had that thought on some level, right?
Hmm.
That comes up in like the Tibetan Buddhist world where they'll have these texts that they say are revealed later or something, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So the idea of a revealed text. But it also gets to something interesting about this Philemon thing. We'll explore it as we go, I guess. But that on the one hand, he felt this pressure to do these spiritual things that had a certain amount of risk he felt with it, right? Like
Hmm.
he felt a little bit of like, I better explore this. And he felt like he had this inner spirit guide thing kind of
Yes.
pressuring him. And it was not always comfortable for him, right? Because it would force him to take risks. And I was listening to a passage in the MDR, which is kind of his memoirs, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, where he talks about this diamond idea. And he's like, yeah, I had this diamond and it really pushed me. It pushed me beyond my comfort zone in some ways. I'm paraphrasing, obviously,
Mm,
and sometimes it pushed me in ways that affected my relationships, affected my life, affected me professionally. And he drops this weird phrase of like, it pushed me into the ideas that I probably looked silly and foolish to my peers.
mm,
And you obviously can see like he's around these other people like Freud and these other psychologists, and he's really coming up with these ideas that are very psychospiritual. And that was going to be rejected. There's no doubt that was not going to be accepted by people who were his peers. But he felt like he needed to keep doing it, which says something interesting about the whole daemon idea. Or sorry, I keep saying the diamond idea. I've heard it both ways, so sometimes I flip. But anyways, yeah, it's a really interesting story.
hmm.
Um, well, I was going to compare it to the archetype idea because you brought it up, Daniel. So that's really interesting. I think a lot of times you think about Jung, it's the archetype. So you would go, well, what's the difference between this and an archetype? And just to understand this a little bit more, so I think the diamond idea is different from the archetype, and that the archetype, talking about Greek stuff, is more like the Platonic forms, right? This idea that there are these fundamental ideas, fundamental templates that kind of reflect how people see the world. They're the lenses through which people see the world. And if you get to like Plato, famously, he talks about this kind of idea that there's these like archetypal forms. And if you kind of look at Jung in that way, you can see that Jung is kind of channeling these older ideas and trying to reinvigorate modern thought with things that were Greek and things that were, more traditional, Gnostic, and so on. So examples of this archetype thing would be like there's a mother archetype and a father archetype and an archetype of femininity, the animate,
Right.
and an archetype of masculinity, the animists and tricksters and shadows and all these different kinds of things. So with that, it's kind of the notion that these are kind of the general templates that are kind of there for everybody. And this leads to this idea, we'll get to Kastrup's talk about this later, of the collective unconscious. But it's really interesting to emphasize not that, but this diamond idea, which sort of has an archetypal source in a way, but then is sort of a channel that becomes much more personal and much more kind of embodied in something that's connected to that particular person and their way of seeing the world. So it's like an archetype that's very important for that person, but also in a certain sense very personalized and very connected to that particular person in some way.
Hmm.
That has a real strong meaning for them outside of just, being an archetype that's sort of a universal concept or something. So I think that's really interesting. And I think that's an interesting place to start. If you think about the body influencing from one end and the spirit from the other end, and you start saying there's these spiritual diamond like figures that are going to like be part of each of our own inner worlds, that's quite interesting, right? You got something more about that before I You're cool with it. So, anyways, and one of the things that's talked about with this, and you could see Jung feeling this way about this character Philemon, that he felt he made this connection with, was that the diamond has sort of this deeper sense of vision for that person, a sense of what they should be doing, a sense of what might be their fate or destiny or the deeper meaning of their life. Again, Jung talks about this in his memoirs, feeling this feeling and then acknowledging that in a way this whatever this is, this diamond thing has more insight, more depth than that person's kind of normal sense of self, or like we'll get to the concept later on, but what you might call ego consciousness, this sense of your own kind of individual identity. It's using the word you were using earlier, Daniel. It's kind of transcendent of that. It's a genius, right? So it has insights into things that are kind of, again, beyond what would be the normal range of understanding for that person. You got something on that? It's
No.
deep. Okay.
Yeah.
So, it has this idea. There's ups and downs you can see with this. And I have to admit, I'm going to like this part of this episode I thought was interesting when I was thinking about it, Daniel, because I imagine you and I are going to like talk this through in a big picture sense, but it's going to have a lot to do with the way we're going to react to it too. So I sort of acknowledged like, okay, this is a little bit how I feel about this notion, and for you too. So we'll chat through it. We'll try to do justice to what Jung was saying, but with the acknowledgement, especially in this part, that it's going to have a little bit of our, at least my own thought involved with it, and I imagine for you too. So I think the big thing this is that this diamond is going to push this individual forward, and especially kind of spiritually, it's going to have this push, right? If you look at Jung's Philemon experience, it wasn't like pushing him about like nothing. It was pushing him in these areas that were very profound and meaningful, and trying to open up new gates of understanding for him. And this was weird because when I was like listening to people talk about this, sometimes I felt like that part was missed, that word spiritual. And I'm not sure if it's because, again, I listened to some psychologists who were Jungians talking about this. And I thought, well, okay, that idea that what's happening in the diamond is it's making not just a push, but a push that's for spiritual depth and profundity. They would sort of gloss that in some weird way. And I don't know if that's because there's a secularization process
Mm-hmm.
and they wanted to kind of take the spiritual side out. But my own feeling on this was like, yeah, no, this is pushing in a very particular way. And it has a vision for the person and the person's own sense of self to grow and evolve spiritually into higher truths, higher expressions of those truths. So it's not just, like a creative force in terms of like maybe something artistic and creative, just in a more narrow sense, or not in the sense of like it's just trying to tell you like what to do with your life on like a practical level or something like that, like where to put your
Mm-hmm.
investments in which cryptocurrency or something like that.
Mm.
Mm. It's trying to get you to do something that obviously has a kind of a higher objective. It's not just about like success in life in a more shallow sense. And I was listening to people talk about this and I was like, okay, it's almost like they're editing out that spiritual part. They're clipping it. And they kind of gave examples of like someone whose diamond was directing one of their patients who's a woman who's getting more known as an influencer. And I was like, I don't think that's what Philemon was about. I'm not trying to like, you know, spiritual one-upmanship or something like that. But it was really weird to hear. So my general thought would be, yeah, if you start talking about a diamond, it has an agenda for the person that's something more transcendent. Does that make
Mm-hmm.
sense to you too?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so.
So that's one part of this. In the midst of this, like we were talking about, though, this may not always be comfortable, right? Like this diamond might be pushing the person in ways that aren't easy for them. And then it gets to the question of like, well, what kind of demands would this diamond figure do that would be challenging? Like in what ways? So as I started brainstorming this for myself and just thinking about, my life is working with people, I thought, well, normally what seems to happen here is this part of the person will kind of push in a way that is outside of what seems practical or outside of what seems to be, conventional, you might say, in the Buddhist tantric sense. It may conflict with what might seem to be the more kind of rational, practical demands of the world or practical demands of the society, the diamond will be pushing the person out of that because it's trying to get to the person to do something more transcendent, which almost sort of naturally involves pushing beyond these things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that potentially creates tension in people. Again, because it's not stuff that's practical, it's not stuff that necessarily results in like material gains, right? In any obvious sense. It's things where it's pushing you to where the reward is more meaning and purpose rather than, you know, pragmatic success on some level. So I think that's kind of interesting. That's kind of my main feeling of where the tension comes up with people around this, but interested to hear your thoughts too.
Tension in what way?
Well, you know, the diamond will want you to do something with your life that's more risky and doesn't seem practical, or
Mm-hmm.
to, you know, uh, uh, pursue a life path that other people don't understand, that aren't obvious that's
Mm.
going to come to success. You know, it's like operating in a different way, right?
So you're saying like people who might be more artistic leaning, pursuing a life of creativity and art versus going to school and becoming an engineer and doing painting on the weekends, having that sort of internal pressure, that pressure internally as well as some kind of external pressure from parents to perhaps get a secure job so that they're not, financially struggling or something like this, right?
Yeah, I mean,
I'm thinking of your dad, Eric, who,
yeah, I thought that my dad too when I was thinking about this too.
yeah, who was
Synchronicity,
like loved
Jung.
painting.
Yeah, and it became a big deal. I mean, one of my little personal Jungian success stories was like my dad was kind of a very angry, frustrated person working in corporate America.
Hmm.
And at a certain point, I mean, as a teenager, just as kind of an intuitive thing, I had seen pictures of him painting when he was young and he looked so happy. And I was like, let me buy him some painting equipment. And it like took off and he just started painting and painting and painting. And I did have that thought. I thought, well, maybe part of my dad's inner diamond was to do that kind of self expression,
Mm.
but he kind of repressed it, you know, in order to, because he was afraid, to be honest, if I get to my dad, you know, he grew up poor. He grew up in, CHA housing, Chicago Housing Authority, public housing, you know, what were essentially like projects, right? So he grew up in that state. He didn't have a dad and he was just frightened. So I think a lot of his life, he sort of suppressed that thing, you know? But I mean, I think there's a lot of moments in someone's life where this happens. Do I do the pragmatic thing? Do I choose like the pragmatic relationship? Do I choose the pragmatic career? You know, we can all kind of figure that out. It's not hard on some level to go, okay, this is the pragmatic route. But you know, I think Jung gets this. This diamond will go, no, you got to go this other way. You know,
Mm.
and you know, your ego conscious will say, oh, that doesn't seem like a good direction to go in. You
Yeah.
know, you can see it. That feels more risky. That feels like the more risky way to live my personal life. Jung took risks in his personal life, you know, kind of that's we've had episodes around that too. Or that
Hmm.
seems like a more risky way to pursue my professional life, or more risky thing to go into some completely new area of spirituality that feels threatening to my maybe what I was brought up with, or whatever you might happen to say. That's
Hmm.
my gut feeling, but maybe you see that different. I'd be curious if you do, but I tend to see this as the main tension in people for me, in my looking at people.
Yeah, between we'll say practical choices that make sense for right now versus inspiration that makes less sense on a practical level. To
Yeah,
be to to like step into that mode of uh continual inspiration as your source of food, really, as your source of growth, as your North Star, as opposed to the steady growth, the steady kind of ascendance towards stability, financial stability, economic stability.
and I think people feel this, and this is a subject that obviously we talked about on this show, little pod in different ways, right? We did our nine
Hmm.
things that can fuck up your life
Hmm.
episodes that were the Taoist versions of this. I think there's a universal truth around this that Jung is tapping into, that there'll be this tension, right? Doing like, okay, that's the road less taken or something like that, right? In the old
Hmm.
Robert Frost poem, I got to that part in the woods the path went two directions, and am I willing to do that other thing? And it does seem like Jung kind of gets like that diamond has a tendency to do that, to push you into these places that, I don't think on purpose, but maybe somewhat. So you develop courage, you know,
Hmm.
you develop will, but maybe just, one of my ideas was that, and we'll get to it, but like this idea that, the diamond wants you to develop in ways that aren't always like in obvious parallel to what would be the most pragmatic ways to easily live your life in a social setting. It doesn't do that, right? Because it has a different
Hmm.
agenda. It probably
Hmm.
doesn't care on some level, like I know this is how you're supposed to do things, but you got to go this way. And I don't care. I think Jung felt that in his own life. Yeah.
So I was reading the notes that you had, and then I have my own as well, and a thought ran across my mind for a moment. You tell me what you think, but I just had this, I don't know, moment of genius, if you will, where it seemed like this diamond force in one's life helps us to grow,
Mhm.
and that if we don't do the things that are required for growth, then we will, and obviously this is going to fall, against some people's beliefs in general, but that then we will absolutely come back and repeat. And so some of this, I think, is a natural product of our own evolution. It's at least in my interpretation, it's sort of an embodiment of spiritual, psychological, personal evolution coming to the forefront to say, hey, I need you to do this thing or these things. I need you to be challenged. I need you to challenge yourself in this way because we need a certain kind of growth in this incarnation. And you have an opportunity to do something beyond simply the mundane. As difficult as the mundane can be sometimes, because we're not going to sit here and say, oh, yeah, it's super easy. It's very difficult right now for lots of people in this country and around the world for various reasons, some physical, some financial, some many, many reasons. So the mundane is,
Absolutely true. Absolutely true.
yeah,
And that has to be factored in as well. And we'll try to do it. Yeah.
yeah,
Do
yeah.
that justice. Mhm.
Yeah, and so the mundane is not exactly like you don't just brush it away, wipe it off, and move on. But it's also to say that that's not the end all. You're not finished. And that goes for people who are also stable. If you have steady job, insurance, so on and so forth, you could support yourself and your family. Like your job isn't done, you're still a person here and you have soul level inspiration, your embodiment of your own evolution knocking on the door of your mind or your heart and saying, hey, don't sit on your haunches now because you got the picket white fence and whatever else that goes along with it. That's not it. That's part of it, but that's certainly not the end all be all. And the calling of your soul to move itself towards a higher place while you're still around is you know is a whisper for some, is a nagging voice to another, and is a shouting match for yet other people. So, yeah.
Yeah. My feeling on that personally has been something like, okay, yeah, I still have to function in a world that doesn't have these spiritual things as its agenda. It doesn't. Right. So I'll just acknowledge that. Right. And that means that I'll have to do things that will pragmatically take care of business. Right. But on the other hand, I always have to keep in mind that there's another agenda that's also flowing at the same time, right? And not lose track of that. That idea that there's something more that's pushing to something again, more deep, more profound, more spiritually enlightening, and so on, right? So I think that's just how we have to live our life, and we try to be honest about that on this podcast. And people
Yeah.
are in easier or tougher situations about this, and then I got some thoughts on this even more as we go. But what you were bringing up was also interesting because I did listen to a little bit of our Bernardo Kastrup talking about this. And he framed it in kind of this interesting way. I think, especially for people who are driven by success
Mm.
in the world, the affairs of the world, you might say. So he said, I think the way he thinks about it, and we can see what we think of his idea, but the way he thinks about it is that what may happen to a lot of people who don't follow their diamond is they'll pursue a bunch of other stuff. And then either when they get those things, they'll realize they're not really satisfying the way they thought they were. So that may happen. And he tried to give examples from his own life, even like as a teenager pursuing some girl that he thought was super pretty and then realizing he wasn't that into her, once he was able to kind of get that relationship or something, kind of recognizing like, okay, this really wasn't what this was about. So he kind of gave this example of being a young man and doing that. But then he also kind of said, you may get things and not like them, or you may get these things and then realize towards the end of your life, like, shit, that stuff wasn't worth it. And he brought up this thing like this feeling of regret that what may happen is you didn't follow your diamond,
Mm-hmm.
you lived your life, and in the end of your life, you're like, oh, fuck, I didn't do the things I was supposed to do. And there'll be this deep sense of regret.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the Buddhist world, they talk about that too in our tantric Buddhism. They say, preciousness of human life, certainty of death. Make sure that you're going to live your life in a way where you have some part of it thinking, when I'm at the end of it, I'm going to be happy with what I did and I won't walk away with regret. And there's a psychological piece in that, in like the great psychologist Eric Erickson too talks about this idea that, when you're an older person, the thing that could really get you is if you don't feel good about the things that you did and you walk away with this feeling of bitterness or regret.
Mm-hmm.
But Castrop went, and I think you'll like this, Daniel. You can tell me what you think. He went a little bit further with it, and he said that's useful too for the spirit in a collective sense, because it dispels that illusion, right? That those things have a value that they don't really have, or that if you don't follow your diamond and you sort of know that there's a push going the other direction and you reject it, and then you do feel that regret allows spirit in the big sense to learn from that experience or something. So
Mm-hmm.
he was almost saying like consciousness or spirit in the grandest sense learns even when those kinds of things happen. So it doesn't make that mistake again. So he was talking about it on an individual level, but he was also talking about it kind of on like this big
Collective.
collective level,
Mm-hmm.
like in Indian philosophy, mind is trying to learn, consciousness or spirit is trying to learn through its experiences, and that's an experience it has to learn from. So he said
So
that person's doing a service too to the collective by doing that. It's interesting
two
take.
two pieces, two statements. One, this is embodied in a statement very commonly said, the youth is wasted on the young. And the song, I don't know if it's Springsteen or who is it, the boss man, as they call him, the lyrics of the chorus go, I wish that I knew what I know now when I was younger.
I think that's Rod Stewart was like one of the original
Oh,
singers
yeah,
of
maybe, yeah,
group. It's like Denny
yeah,
Lane. It's an old like British group. Yeah.
yes,
We played that talking about my dad. We put that at my dad liked that song.
yeah.
We were playing it at my dad's wake. Yeah. Poor old granddad. I
Hmm.
laughed at all his words. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yep. I wish that I knew what I know now when I was stronger.
Yeah.
So that, but that it's embodied in that, and I think, and I really do like that, that it's consciousness reminding itself, hey, do the things, do the things that we need to do for our own evolution as a collective hive, as a being, because we often look at societies as one large being, you know. So if we look at this collective of all life as one large being learning from the itself, you know, essentially, which is what the, you know, many East Indian, East Asian, East Indian traditions believe, that this is a way for it to remind, continually pass down the lessons of missed opportunities, such that it doesn't repeat those same mistakes over and over again. So,
Yeah.
you
It's
know,
tied in with the
it can
idea
be
of
evolution.
evolution too, that you learn from that, like there's an uber mind or something that learns from the
Mm-hmm.
mistakes of each of us or something, right? As it goes, or
Mm-hmm.
right. So I
Yeah,
mean that's a positive attitude. I still have to say, like, it's better not to experience that,
sure.
right? It's an easier road, though he was framing it like those are some of the biggest sacrifices that people make in a way. They
Mm-hmm.
don't pay attention to their diamond. and maybe they fumble it a little bit in some way, but then you learn that you're supposed to pay attention to your diamond, and the collective
Mm-hmm.
learns that on some level. The one that hit me about this, and then maybe we'll like pick up on this next time because there's a couple more things to talk about with this, but um, I thought about the follow your bliss thing from Joseph Campbell, one of our other kind of favorite people. We haven't brought him up in a bit, but one of his lines was that you have to follow your bliss. And I couldn't help thinking that ultimately what the diamond is trying to do is push you in the direction of your bliss, right?
Mm.
And that bliss will be not like the bliss of like a weekend in Vegas or something,
No, you can't compare to
which
that.
can be a little blissful, but like the actual deep, fulfilling bliss of those things that are deep and meaningful and purposeful.
Yeah,
The real joy that comes from that, right? When you really feel like, man, I'm doing something that has real meaning to me and maybe has real meaning just overall. And I'm proud of that and I feel it and I'm learning and I'm growing. That's a kind of
yeah.
a special kind of bliss.
Mm.
So, I mean, the way I would think about that in the Joseph Campbell sense was his advice was, you might as well follow your bliss because that's where you can get your most joy ultimately.
Mm.
And Campbell, I think, recognized too what Jung is recognizing, which that might not always seem like the most pragmatically obvious path or something, but it's the thing that ultimately will have the most reward. And maybe that's what the diamond is trying to like whisper in your ear or something to get you to do that, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
love it.
Yeah.
It's good. It's good.
Yeah. So maybe a little bit next week. Again, we'll do one other little diamond episode, but I think it's a really good introduction to the idea. Thanks,
Yeah,
everybody. Listening.
I think so. Yeah, Eric, as always, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Audience, thank you for tuning in. Like, comment, subscribe. Hit us up, ginandtantra@gmail.com, Gin and Tantra Podcast on the gram. We do this out of love, right? That's what this is. This is a passion project. This is, areas that we find interesting and ways in which that we want to contribute to the larger zeitgeist of conversation, connection, introspection, and perhaps even inspiration. So, from our mouths to your ears. Follow your inner diamond. We'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.